pharma industry is very interested to hear the patient voice. We want to develop products that take the patient into consideration, because at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do, right? We're here to help people to treat their diseases, to have them continue in their lives and do better, and that's a win-win for everyone.
Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of FDA Watch. It's very exciting for Shelly and me. I'm Wayne Pines. I've been involved with FDA for many years, many decades. At one point, I was associate commissioner of the agency. I've edited or authored about 16 books about the agency, and I'm really, really excited to be co-hosting this groundbreaking new podcast.
Thanks, Wayne. And I'm Shelly Garg, the founder and managing partner of Garg Law, full-service FDA-focused law firm. I've been on the private side advising companies and regulated industry on FDA compliance and enforcement for the last 15 years. And I'm also very excited to be co-hosting FDA Watch.
So here's what you can expect from us at FDA Watch. We'll have at least 2 episodes a month. We're going to be independent. We're going to be nonpartisan. We're going to deal with the major issues, the latest developments involving FDA. Shelly and I are going to be keeping an eye on them and bringing them to you. We're going to focus on 4 key areas, 4 core areas: pharmaceuticals and biologics, medical devices and diagnostics, food and dietary supplements, cosmetics and personal care products.
Of course, we'll also be discussing the overall direction of the agency, including what to expect from the new administration. If you subscribe, you'll also get bonus episodes when there's breaking news. And there should be quite a bit of breaking news, right, Wayne?
Absolutely. We have a new administration coming in. Everybody knows that. This administration has promised to make many changes. We have a lot to keep track of, and that's what we're going to do with this podcast. And that's why it's especially timely that we start the podcast now at the beginning of a new administration. On each episode, we're going to have guests. We're going to have the best ones. There'll be veterans of FDA. There'll be current FDA officials. They will be here not to present their personal opinions or biased opinions. We want them to interpret what's going on. We want their analysis, and we want their general overview as to what's going on. Our goal is to make sure that what we're providing is practical information for the people who are subscribing to this podcast.
And in this episode, we'll focus on the pharma space. We have 2 incredible guests to kick off what should be an exciting discussion, and we'll meet them in just a minute. But first, let's get to some headlines.
Okay, headline number 1 from the Pharma desk. The big news, as I just said, is the incoming administration. There's been so much speculation and in some quarters fear about what's in store for drug approvals, especially for the standards for safety and efficacy. The specific category of products, of course, that has been headline news for a long time is vaccines. We can speculate about what's going to happen, and we're going to be doing some speculating today. But the bottom line is that we have to wait and see what happens when new leadership comes into the agency. We'll have we'll be watching this very carefully, and in future episodes, we're going to be delving very, very deep into the transition and into these issues as they emerge. The bottom line is that we need to wait and we need to watch what's going on. Device desk. FDA has announced a communications pilot that would enhance the medical device recall program. And this ties in very neatly, I think, with what's going on with this transition and with the new administration, because as we all know, the potential incoming commissioner who's been nominated, Dr. Makary, is of course known as a great communicator. He's also a surgeon, and he does practice medicine. I think for all of us who are concerned about FDA, that should be encouraging. But he is a great communicator. He's on the news all the time, and he's published so much. The pilot at CDRH is intended to improve the timeliness of communications about corrective actions that are being undertaken by companies and that may be very, very serious, but that have not yet been classified as recalls. And the question is, when do you communicate that kind of information? FDA has said that the effort, the communications pilot, is designed to increase transparency, provide earlier and more timely communications to consumers, to healthcare professionals. We're all going to keep an eye very, very carefully on this, because whatever happens with this communications pilot in terms of the timeliness of announcing information about potential recalls will affect not just devices, but it could affect all products regulated by FDA.
Thanks, Wayne. And from the foods desk, I think the big question continues to remain, how safe are our fruits and vegetables? In the last few weeks, there have been multiple recalls of cucumbers as a result of salmonella, carrots as a result of E. coli, and ready to eat fruits and vegetables as a result of listeria. Now, these recent food recalls really highlight ongoing food safety concerns in the fresh produce industry. And I think really underscores vulnerabilities in farming, processing, and distribution practices. Really, poor hygiene during harvesting, cross contamination in processing facilities, or inadequate cold chain management has led and can continue to lead to widespread outbreaks. But these recent food recalls not only present serious health risks, especially to vulnerable populations, but really erode consumer trust in fresh produce. So I think the question will continue to remain, what is it going to take to limit food safety recalls? Is it stricter enforcement of safety regulations, improved traceability systems, more widespread adoption of best practices in agricultural and food handling operations? So we're looking to see how FDA will continue to address these challenges. From the cosmetics desk, FDA has issued its final rule to increase color additive certification fees. So the new fees include a 10 cent per pound increase for straight colors, including lakes. There are similar increases in fees for repacks of certified color additives and color additive mixtures. Now, FDA says that the increase will allow the agency to continue to provide, maintain, and really equip an adequate color certification, an adequate color addition certification program. But FDA's decision to increase color additive certification fees really has several implications for various stakeholders. There is a potential financial impact on manufacturers, so higher fee increases for production costs for manufacturers can result or may result in financial constraint, leading to higher prices for consumers. Or there could be very well a natural shift to natural alternatives. So this may incentivize, manufacturers to explore natural color alternatives that don't require FDA certification, such as plant-based or mineral-derived colors. But this transition may also be challenging due to stability, cost, or consumer preferences. Now, FDA's kind of impetus for increasing the certification fees has been to allow FDA to allocate more resources to the certification process in hopes to increase faster turnaround time. So we'll see kind of how this plays out and what stakeholders continue to observe with these increased fees. Now, Wayne, let's meet our guests.
Thanks, Shelly. And just to reiterate the way that this podcast is structured, with each podcast, we're going to have headlines from each of our four core categories: pharma, biologics being one, devices and diagnostic products being two, food, and then cosmetics. And then we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into one of those categories. Today, we're going to do pharma. Joining us today is our very, very first guest, Nikki Reeves, and welcome, Nikki. Nikki is a partner at King Spalding. She's an FDA and healthcare regulatory compliance lawyer. She has more than 25 years of experience. She co-chairs King Spalding's Government Matters and Regulatory Practice Management Group, which has more than 200 lawyers and consultants in 8 practice areas. So welcome as the very, very first guest, Nikki, on FDA Watch.
Thank you, Wayne. Very excited to be here.
Thanks, Nikki. Also joining us today is Brian Malkin. Brian is an Associate General Counsel for Regulatory Law at Teva. Brian has more than 30 years of FDA law and policy experience and more than 20 years of intellectual property law experience. Brian spent 9 years at FDA in both the Commissioner's Office in Cedar and at boutique FDA IP and international law firms. Brian, we're really excited to have you. Welcome to FDA Watch, Brian.
Great, glad to be here as well.
So there's a lot to discuss when it comes to pharma and biologics issues. The obvious topic is what's going to happen now that we have a new administration. We know the nominee, Dr. Marty Makary from Johns Hopkins. Let me turn to our guest and start out with Nikki. Nikki, in your view, what should his top priority be if he is indeed the commissioner, or the top priority if he's not the commissioner, for any new commissioner, there will be a new commissioner coming in. What should the new commissioner's top priority be?
Wayne, thank you so much for that question. It's such a good one. So these would be, in my view, the top priorities. I think if we were talking about Dr. Makary specifically, he may have his own priorities that he's intending to set out with, and we can speculate on what those might be. But in my view, regulatory approvals and expediting those to the extent possible with the agency, of course, in such a way that doesn't put public health at risk. And I think that actually may be one priority that Dr. Makary, based on what I'm reading, would seem to agree with. Now, the method to that and how you go about expediting those regulatory approvals in the pharma and the biologic space is, a more complicated question. But that would be one in terms of priorities. Another, and I know it's a topic we'll be getting to in a few moments, but basically how FDA is going to regulate AI and machine learning. And that's such a huge issue, I think, for so many aspects of FDA regulated products and different divisions, but for pharma in particular, and I know we'll be talking more about that. Another, in my view, is, and this is a complicated one too in many ways, because there are traditional ways FDA has gone about this, but there may be more sophisticated ways to look at how to do it. And that is ensuring that the approved products that we have and that are manufactured, particularly outside the United States, but even in the United States, are safe and for the public to use. And this comes up obviously in the device industry as well, but certainly also for pharmaceuticals. And I think one way FDA tries to ensure the safety of products that are manufactured and introduced in the U.S., particularly abroad, is through the FDA inspection program. And, there's a lot to say there too. It's a big, broad topic. But whether or not that's as successful as it could be, there's enough resources there. Is that the best way to help ensure the safety of products that are brought into the United States, from exported and imported into the United States and or manufactured inside the United States? Is, as I said, a little bit more of a complicated question, and whether or not there are other mechanisms and means for getting there. But those are some that come to mind immediately. And then I have one that's a personal favorite. I think it's very important to allow manufacturers to be able to communicate information about their products to physicians and to consumers, to patients. And one of the reasons I think that's so important is just the healthcare system, that model and that we have in the United States, that's been evolving over many, many years. But we are, I think, all could agree, we're in a place where individuals, patients, are often driving their own healthcare and their treatments and how they seek those out. And one way that we do that is through information that we receive, which is obviously prevalent. There are all sorts of mechanisms and means, but certainly by the internet and social media. But allowing for that communication in an appropriate way, of course, and we can talk lots and lots about that, I think is a really important thing. And Wayne, I mentioned that in particular because I think of you as when I started practicing law, one of my Bibles was the FDA Advertising and Promotion Manual, and your name was obviously on the front page of that, having been the author, and I associated you with that issue. So I'd be really interested if I'm allowed to ask you a question, what you think about that.
Why don't we get that in a minute? Because first I want to ask Brian his answer to the question, and then Nikki, I'll give you a chance to come
Okay.
back and
Sounds good.
ask me a question. That's fine. I want to have a dialogue on these kinds of matters. But Brian, let me ask you the same question about an incoming commissioner. What should his or her, and see what happens here. Um, uh, what should the new commissioner's top priorities be?
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of the priorities that Nikki laid out. I mean, those are really good topics to address. I'll sort of add that just from someone who used to work in the commissioner's office and sort of seeing some different commissioners come in over time, FDA is a big ship to steer, if you will. I mean, there's a lot of regulated products that FDA is in charge of. And so any commissioner that comes in, there's a big learning curve to learn about all these different areas because Dr. McAree is going to have some position more on drugs and his knowledge base, right? But he probably knows less about some of the things that Shelly was mentioning, like about foods or some other areas. He may, right? I mean, he has his opinion, but that may not be his primary area. So I think that's one thing to take into account. The other thing is, I would sort of stress more that I think in terms of they want to gain more trust in America. These are sort of the talking points that come from, I think, all the nominees in the healthcare space the Trump administration is outlining. And so along those lines, I think in terms of gaining the trust back, there should be more information that provided in terms of transparency between FDA's decision making and sort of and along the lines of what Nikki mentioned, the timelines of when things are going to be decided, when things don't get decided. Like for you have there are UFA programs, as you know, for all the user fees for various products. 90% of them are supposed to be hit by certain target dates. But what happens to those other 10% when they don't meet their target dates? There's not a communication, sort of the lines like Nikki mentioned, communication back to industry. When is FDA going to get back on those other 10%? And when? And so I think that's trust. It's not just for the American public, but it's also industry and FDA. And in terms of where I see McAree sort of going with this is I read his book, Blind Spots, and I'm getting sort of a sense of him as an individual and what he's going after. And it seems like what he likes to do is challenge things that are out there and maybe preconceptions that he thinks are wrong. Those are what he's calling the blind spots, where sort of doctors and or maybe FDA in this case could get things wrong and how he may be critical about them. And some of the things he outlined of just sort of going back to the commissioner, actually, who was in charge when I was there for Commissioner Kessler. He was critical of him for not getting enough information about silicone breast implants before banning them, but at the same time, not asking for more information from drug manufacturers, in this case for oxycodone, where the expectation would be it's an opioid. Why wouldn't a doctor think it could be addictive? FDA took it and listened and believed with the sponsor that it wouldn't be addictive and didn't require studies to demonstrate that, right? And didn't even look for warning signs from pharmacies of prescriptions that were going up for people, repeat prescriptions that should have been a signal that maybe there was something going on there. And so I think he's going to be pushing the limits of the folks that are at FDA and questioning them more about why they do what they do and how they do it and how they can do it better. And along the lines of also providing information that he views is important to get out to the public. And that could tie to foods like what Shelly was mentioning, more food education. He's talked about peanut allergies as being an issue, and things like that, miscommunications leading to increased peanut allergies and the whole host of topics. But and I think we'll also see more of an emphasis on what has been called the area of medical foods, areas where he's been critical of the food pyramid, and so I think he views education and other preventive health to be something that's overlooked and something that FDA has as part of ensuring the public health should step up to the plate and play a bigger role.
Brian, I also want to add, I mean, what do you think about in terms of the commissioner addressing drug shortages, increasing manufacturing resilience to kind of incentivize technologies to really, reduce production disruptions and diversifying the supply chain, right? Encouraging domestic and international supply chain operations to avoid depending on a single region or manufacturer for really critical drugs. Like, my hope is that that's the focus. But what do you think in terms of their of the potential commissioners focus in that realm.
Yeah, I hope that would be the focus as well. I'm a little concerned, I have to admit, because there are programs like right now. There's programs like BioSecure and other talk about raising tariffs for the sources of a lot of the active pharmaceutical ingredients that come into our country. If they're coming, let's say, from China, for example, and that's going to, in my opinion, and I guess I should say this in the very front on the opinions the things that I'm saying, much like Wayne and what you were saying in the beginning, these are my opinion. They're not the opinion of my employer, of Teva. But I'm concerned about that, right? It could make it harder for companies to not raise prices. And there's a lot of pressure with the IRA and other discussion about, how much pharmaceutical products cost. It's only going to raise the cost of doing business. So it's going to be harder and harder to maintain those lines. And in the generic drug industry, I'll be honest where that goes, the margins are very thin. So the moment you raise costs, anywhere, it goes across the board, right, for everybody.
Right.
And drug shortages, as I've seen happen, a lot of them come down to because companies can't turn a profit on a product. If they can't turn a profit, I've worked as outside counsel. I can speak to that from that perspective. I've had companies that sometimes withdrew their product from the market, either because FDA asked them to perform a study that was very costly and they weren't making that much money on the product to begin with, and they didn't know what the outcome would be, or because the cost of making the product exceeded how much they were making for it. They took a closer look at it. And I'll give you an example, even with nitrosamines that's out there. We didn't talk about it here. Looking at nitrosamines, it forced companies to go back and look at their products and determine if they were making money on them or not, even though to comply with the requirements. So sometimes there's a backfire effect from FDA's asking for more information that then companies take a closer look and they go, wait, are we making money on this? What is FDA asking us to do? And I don't know if it's always, contemplated from that perspective of where FDA sits.
Yeah.
On drug shortage, I think, that's been identified and it is a public health emergency because sometimes there are real shortages of essential drugs. The solutions that, we've been talking about really aren't solutions, and that is notifying the FDA in advance and keeping track. But that doesn't really deal with the underlying problems. What we really need are solutions that deal with the underlying problems associated with drug shortages. I think, Brian, you've identified them. I think they're largely economic and making sure that companies have the capacity to make drugs. Nikki, you were going to ask me a question before, so I wanted to give a chance to do that.
Yes, well, I think of you as the author of the FDA Advertising and Promotion Manual for so many years, and so I was very interested in your views about whether a new commissioner would or should be focused on how companies are communicating information about their product. I think Dr. McCary's already, there have been some references to a focus on, for example, no longer permitting DTC broadcast advertising and the implications of that, but very curious about your views on promotion.
Yeah, well, we've heard I haven't not heard McCary express those reservations. Maybe, he has, but certainly Robert Kennedy has, and Elon Musk has. And they both said that on their first day in office, they're going to ban DTC television advertising. I think the chances of that are zero when they're educated about the economics of the way that DTC advertising supports the networks. You don't have to watch much television at all to see DTC advertising. I think that when they hear that Fox News is not going to want them to ban the source of their money, I think that there will be no effort to ban it. But with regard to enforcement generally, you said it exactly. McCary has been interested. He is a communicator. I think he will have more interest in advertising regulation than previous commissioners have. And I would expect there to be a look at some of the guidances and perhaps some of the regulations that are in this area, and maybe even more enforcement. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more enforcement as we move forward. So yeah, I think that will be an area especially because Macari is, as you mentioned, a prime communicator. He could be, Scott Gottlieb was the premier tweeter, and we'll see whether Macari he'll be using other methods to communicate information.
Right. Well, you mentioned tweeting, and I feel like my view is that companies are moving more and more into using social media and influencers in particular. And my most recent observation is the new guidance FDA issued over the summer, allowing companies to correct misinformation. There seem to be arming the industry with the ability to use their own resources to help FDA campaign against misinformation, particularly with influencers inappropriately promoting their treatments for certain disease states and the like that are just extremely inappropriate. And I think that's a great use of industry resources in the context of social media and influencers in particular. But to me, I think that's the kind of the new world order, the new pathway, a new way of communicating. And I would expect that would be something that the agency will focus on, particularly if a new commissioner has an interest in that.
One final word on that. Dr. Califf has identified misinformation about healthcare on the internet as a public health emergency. He uses the word emergency. There's it's a mega problem. It's not something that any agency can solve. The FDA, has taken, trivial, I'm not going to say trivial, minor steps to deal with it by making sure that they become a source of information. But that is an issue that needs to be dealt with. I would hope that an incoming commissioner, whether it's Dr. Macari or anyone, will address that, because I think it is I'm not going to call it emergency, but it is a major public health problem.
Thanks, Wayne. Let's move to another really big topic, which is AI and innovation. So FDA has been providing guidance, but clearly more is needed. What kind of guidance are pharmaceutical companies looking for from FDA? Brian, why don't you start us off, and then Nikki, you can respond.
Sure, thanks. Well, so FDA has been issuing more guidance on AI, but I think what I've seen in those guidance is that they're very sort of general, and they talk about FDA applying sort of a risk-based approach, if you will, in terms of how they're going to be regulating it, but it's not very clear exactly where they're going there. The other thing that I did a panel last year with some folks from FDA on AI, and basically what I heard from them was that they're regulating products much the same as they do in general, whether there's AI or not involved in it. They want companies to tell them if they've used AI and where they've used it. But then beyond that, what they haven't been doing, and I think what industry could be learning from FDA, is since they now know where AI is being used in these applications, if they would provide some more information about the benefits or risks of using AI in different elements of drug development. So, for example, like molecule selection, optimization, drug formulation, manufacturing, use for software for devices, including things like the PDORS prescription, where you're essentially using devices in the context of a drug. And then in terms of clinical study selection, adaptive clinical trials, and use in data generation, it'd be good to hear from FDA, their lessons learned of, where to use it. I think it's important at this nascent phase for FDA not to really overregulate products, because they are still learning, in terms of where it's appropriate to be used and where not. But when they talk about when they're going to regulate, they have to be really clear, because right now the guidance is vague and subject to a lot of interpretation. And the other thing that I'll sort of add to that is that AI is also something that FDA could be using potentially to get more timely reviews of their products. Of course, we'd like to know when they're using it as well. I think it goes both ways, right? If industry needs to tell FDA should tell industry when they're using AI to do that, to use AI in their products. But there's a lot of potential benefits, but also some risks just to manage.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. Nikki, we would love your thoughts on that as well.
Absolutely. And Brian mentioned the good point that FDA now, certainly for some period of time has required companies to notify the agency when they're using AI in the context of development in their submissions. But I think one of the things, so I'm certain FDA is, educating itself over time as they learn more and more information about how companies are using AI through that context and others. But I guess my point would be, even though they may have noticed and be aware that a company may, for example, have used AI in the development of a product or in their submission, the depth and the use of that AI, how it seems to me that it's a bit challenging for the agency to know the quality of the AI being used, the quality of the AI model, the reliability of it. And so setting some sort of universal standards or at least vernacular and definitions and the like, so that the industry can understand where the lines are and the agency can as well, I think would be valuable. I think more discussion and more precision about the concept of AI and machine learning and how that's used in all contexts really would be better. It'll just help demystify these things. I think these are still just words that folks, sort of like word salad, that people use and talk about to describe certain things, but I don't know that everyone always is saying the same thing. So it's a little confusing and not entirely clear. I will say that against the backdrop of agreeing with another point Brian made, which is, you want to have a risk-based approach when you talk about a regulatory framework governing AI and machine learning. And so I'm not advocating for something more, something different from that. But I am just observing what I think most anyone would observe at this stage, when it seems novel and the agency's still catching up to what industry may or may not be doing,
Right.
how they're using AI.
Yeah.
I want to cover one other topic before we break this first episode, and that has to do with the patient voice. We see increased attention to the patient over the years. Teva, of course, engages with patients all the time, as do all drug companies. We see a lot more direct-to-consumer marketing these days. We see a lot more support for patients. I'm going to ask Brian first, and then Nikki. We're entering an administration which is a populist administration. I hope that's viewed as a neutral term here. It's not intended to be either pro or it's just a populist administration. What changes, if any, do you see in terms of the role of the patient and the patient voice and real world evidence as we move forward into this next administration?
Well, I think it's hard to figure out what the new administration is going to do in terms of patient voice, to be honest. But in terms of what I've seen happening at the agency and industry, the pharma industry is very interested to hear the patient voice. We want to develop products that take the patient into consideration, because at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do, right? We're here to help people to treat their diseases, to have them continue in their lives and do better. And that's a win-win for everyone, right? What I've seen over the years that the FDA, and I'm being a little critical with my former employer there, is CDER has been a little bit slower really to adopt the talk about the patient voice. CDRH on the device side has been a lot more proactive in having companies seek out the patient voice and incorporating that into their product applications and telling them what they have to do that and be part of the process. What I've seen happen more is that while industry spends a lot of time trying to hear the patient voice, incorporate it into their products, FDA isn't really listening a lot of the time. Like, they somehow still think they know better. They're taking the stance, sort of when I was in the 90s, we did actually have these conversations about the patient voice and how could we incorporate them and what would that mean and what did doctors want and that we felt like that doctors were saying the FDA thinks they know better than everyone. They sit sort of in their high chairs or whatnot, coming to conclusions on things. And I'll give you an example of that just to make it more concrete. In the orphan drug space, there's a thing called clinical superiority, where if you're the same drug, same indication, one of the ways you can get sort of in as the same drug for that same indication is if you demonstrate a major contribution to patient care, right? Well, who makes that decision? That's always FDA. FDA, I've never seen, in my knowledge, has reached out to patients to ask them whether a change from one product to another is a major contribution to patient care. They make their own conclusion, and it's subjective. It's a very subjective standard. There are things that they talk about in other kinds of contexts, maybe with drug devices, so-called human factor studies that get done. Well, does FDA ask patients for what are important factors for them? No, FDA comes to their own conclusion. Sometimes they have companies just take their best guess at what that might be, only to tell them later they have to go back and do it all over again. So I think there are opportunities really for hearing the patient voice. I think it is more important than just having sort of random stakeholder meetings for classes of products. And I think that maybe FDA could learn from industry more about, how they go about incorporating it into product development and taking it into more account for products going forward. So I think hopefully we do have that era coming in with the new administration. But I haven't heard that as part of the discussion yet about making people healthy, but hopefully it is worked into the rubric as well.
Nikki?
So I've observed, FDA is continuing with their patient listening sessions. They've got their patient-focused drug development program, the PFDD. So those things, are already happening, and there's clearly a focus, or very public-facing focus on attempting to get more information from patients and engage patients on drugs and on their experience and their views on different products. But I guess one thing that might be interesting, and I'm just reacting to your point or your word choice of a more populist administration here, it would be whether or not and to what extent we might have more transparency around what FDA is doing with that information going forward. I think now it's clear that they have this program, they're collecting this information, they're having these listening sessions. There seems to be resources devoted to all of that, but how that translates beyond the program and what I can see, public facing information about it into the actual, decisions FDA may or may not be making and other kind of ways that information might be used, the level of influence patients might actually have on the agency may be interesting to see what happens going forward in the new administration and how that program might change.
Okay, that's great.
FDA Watch is a media sponsor of a terrific upcoming event we want to tell you about. FDA Watch subscribers are invited to register for the annual meeting of NISBA's Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Law section held in the New York City Hilton Midtown on January 16th, 2025 from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. The meeting features 2 panels moderated by Brian Malkin from this episode of the podcast. All registered lawyers and paralegals may register. Call 518-463-3200. That's 518-463-3200.
I'm now going to shift gears and turn briefly to another segment that we have, and that's our resource link. That's a segment where we provide our listeners with some valuable links that they may want to check out. So, Shelly, let's share them with our audience right now.
Will do, but I want to point out first that these links will be included in our show notes. So there's no need to write anything down.
So let's look at our first pharma resource link. It's from FDA. It's a report called Upholding Public Trust, FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations' Critical Role in Bringing Drug Criminals to Justice. FDA facilitates product recalls, market withdrawals, and safety alerts, but when bad actors circumvent the system, FDA explains, the Office of Criminal Investigation gets involved. And this report should provide some perspective on that. In the medical devices area, Our resource link is from the FDA Group's white paper called Preparing for the FDA's Quality Management System Regulation. The FDA Group notes that the medical device industry is on the cusp of a significant regulatory shift as the FDA harmonizes the QSR with ISO, I won't go into the number, but with an ISO requirement. The question is whether your organization is ready for this upcoming implementation, and this white paper, provides some guidance with regard to that.
Thanks, Wayne. Moving on to our food resource link, it's a request for information that FDA issued in November on PFAS and seafood. So FDA says it is seeking scientific data and information from the seafood industry, academia, state and federal agencies, as well as other interested entities on PFAS concentrations in seafood, the surrounding environment and processing water, as well as mitigation strategies for reducing exposure to PFAS in seafood. Finally, the cosmetic resource link, it's from PCPC, and it's the announcement of its annual regulatory and legal conference in 2025. That's always a very well-attended conference. PCPC says the conference is scheduled for May 13th through the 15th in New Orleans, so you may want to check that out. And on that note, Wayne, it's time to thank our incredible guests, Nikki Reeves and Brian Malkin, for being such incredible guests on our inaugural episode. Nikki and Brian, you've really set a high bar for future episodes, and we really appreciate your time and expertise in discussing this episode. We'd also like to thank our executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, and our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister.
And Shelly, as I conclude, this is important. If anybody wants to suggest a guest to be on our podcast, or if they want to be a guest themselves, or they want to be a marketing partner or a sponsor, the best way to do that is to contact us. And the address is info, I-N-F-O, at fdawatch.net. I'm going to repeat that, info at fdawatch.net. Finally, if we'd appreciate it, if you're so inclined, give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. It really, really does make a difference. And remember to follow us, and remember to subscribe, and encourage all your friends and neighbors and family to subscribe. It's free. And that's the only way you can make sure that you and others won't miss a single episode of FDA Watch.
Thanks, Wayne. And just to underscore, I think this dialogue is so critical, especially given the incoming administration, this open, independent, objective dialogue. So we really appreciate your support in continuing the discussion. And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.